My name is Colleen Connolly, and I'm the head of Member Services, Strategy, and Product Development for AgencyIQ here at POLITICO. It's so nice to be with you this afternoon, and thank you so much for attending our webcast today. For those who are not familiar, POLITICO launched AgencyIQ in January of this year, and it has been an eventful inaugural year for our division. We developed AgencyIQ in direct response to subscriber feedback. We had many conversations with POLITICO readers who asked us for deeper insight into what was happening within the regulatory space, specifically at the FDA. So we spent the better part of 2 years doing market research across 2018 and 2019, speaking with countless regulatory affairs professionals across the US and around the globe to truly understand how could we fill the insight gap that existed. From those conversations and with the help of key advisors from the industry as well as former FDA officials, we formed AgencyIQ, which is a regulatory intelligence service aiming to simplify, monitor, and provide impactful and insightful analysis on the FDA to regulatory affairs professionals in the life sciences industry. Our mission is really threefold. One, increase the capacity of our clients by monitoring the FDA on a daily basis so that nothing falls through the cracks and so that you can effectively communicate to key stakeholders. Two, track each guidance, new rule, update coming out of the FDA on a daily basis and analyze the historical background, the context, the latest news, and of course, the future impact that that development will have on the industry. And three, what you will see today, enabling our clients to lift up out of the weeds and feel more proactive by providing a 30,000-foot view analysis and forecast on critical topics to their organization. We are honored to have Alec Gaffney at the helm of what we do here at AgencyIQ, so I will pass the reins to him in just a moment. If you are interested in learning more about AgencyIQ and exploring subscription options, you will find my email at the end of the presentation in a thank you note to follow, and myself or someone from my team can touch base with you directly. And with that, I'll hand it over to Alec to take it from here.
Fantastic. Thanks, Colleen, and thanks to all of you for joining today's webinar. As Colleen said, my name is Alec Gaffney. I'm head of research here at AgencyIQ. I'm also joined by one of my esteemed colleagues, Laura D'Angelo, who heads up medical device research and analysis for us at AgencyIQ. Today's webinar is going to be wide-ranging. We've got a lot of things that we want to talk about, but there's a key question that ties together absolutely everything, and that is, what is the FDA likely to do in 2021 after a fundamentally challenging year for the FDA? I don't think anyone expected the FDA to have such a wide range of challenges on its doorstep in 2020, and many of their challenges have become your challenges. So when we were looking forward to 2021 and what we were trying to do was really focused on a key question. What's next? What can we prepare for? What are the things that are kind of the known unknowns that we know something's going to happen, or the FDA has forecasted that it will do something, but what can we learn about that? How do we think about that? Is that a big deal, a small deal? And what we've done is we've grouped together what we've learned into a few different types of areas. What is the new headwinds that we're seeing? And those headwinds are clearly including COVID-19 and all that is coming out of that. We'll have a new president, and therefore a new administration, and therefore some new leadership at the FDA. So what do we make of that? Is that a big deal? Is it likely to be a little bit more of the same? We'll get into that. We also have specific forecasts for the 8 industry sectors that you see here. We'll divide those up into 2 different areas. Areas where there is disruption, in some cases profound disruption, that's likely to affect these medical product sectors. And then we're also seeing some sectors that are having transitions, and in many cases toward a new and more amicable regulatory pathway that may make it even easier for certain products to get to market. So without any further ado, let's jump right into things. I think the biggest thing on everyone's mind that I keep hearing is we've just seen phase 1 of COVID. There's been a lot of action by the FDA trying to get its feet underneath it. Now that we have a vaccine, now that we're moving forward, what does phase 2 look like? Does it look different? Are there things that the FDA is going to be challenged with next year? And I think that there are some really big things that FDA needs to keep track of. There are 4 key challenges that when Laura and I and our broader research team, and we've got a few other folks who are on today's call, we're thinking about. These are what we really kept focusing on and hearing from some of our industry sources. The first is shifting away from the use of emergency use authorization. I think it's no surprise that the FDA has leveraged more EUAs in the last year than it has in its entire collective history combined, and then probably multiplied by a factor of like 5. It is just awe-inspiring to see how quickly the FDA has moved. However, in 2021, that's going to present some challenges. And there are a few sub-challenges here. One is, how do you start to move away from the use of EUAs? Do you move toward approvals? If you have the FDA, for example, approving new diagnostics through, say, a PMA or a de novo pathway, does that then preclude the use of additional follow-on EUAs after that? Well, potentially, unless there are certain carve-outs around not having enough of a product on the market, and the FDA has said that it intends to use that carve-out of the EUA authority quite a lot. There are also some products that were marketed without an EUA, including in the diagnostic space, and the FDA is going to have a challenge just figuring out what products are out there on the market, what does it know about, what does it not know about. The third sub-challenge there is just timing. Does it seek to say immediately as of, I'm making up a date here, March 1st, 2021, if you don't have a PMA or a clearance or a de novo, get off the market? Or is it going to have a phased-in approach? Is it going to require proof that companies are moving toward the prospect of approval or clearance? There are lots of things that could change here. And while we know that the FDA is moving toward these, a clearer pathway through guidance, that's look to 2021 for a lot of these questions to be answered. The second thing, and we'll talk about this a lot more in the next slide, is a backlog of policies. FDA went into 2021 with a pretty robust regulatory plan, strategy, and things that it wanted to do. This year, though, it has not been able to get many of those things done. It's not like it's saying, oh my gosh, well, we want to do it in 2020, but we couldn't, better throw it in the trash heap. These things are just being pushed forward. However, there could be some adjustments there. And I think one thing that FDA has made clear is it knows how busy FDA is. It knows how busy industry is as well, also dealing with COVID. So if there is something like an implementation period for, we'll come back to this later, but ISO 13485 in the medical device industry, that's a shift from the current quality standard to more of an international standard run by the ISO group. There may be a longer implementation period that is more accommodating to the fact that people have some other stuff going on and they need a minute to kind of get their own bearings before they start making some big changes to how they do stuff. FDA staffing is another big one we are keeping an eye on, and in particular, FDA staff has been working really, really difficult hours for some of their staff, including CBER and their vaccine staff. It's basically been nonstop for weeks or months on end. In 2021, once we start seeing a slow return to normalcy, could we start to see some of these staff departing the agency, either for industry jobs or in the case of plenty of senior staff who are over the age of retirement? Could it be that they just say, you know what, I had a great run, we've got a new Biden administration in place, I feel more confident about leaving my position now that there's a greater prospect that the person who would replace me might be more amenable to the sorts of things that I care about as well. Keep an eye on that, because if certain staff depart, it takes a very long time to get those staff back up to a level of competency where they're able to handle not just the workload, but also the institutional knowledge that allows them to deftly navigate through some of these troubled waters. And finally, a backlog for industry. We were talking about how FDA is just underwater. In some cases, there are literally hundreds or thousands of documents, reviews, pre-EUAs, EUAs, PMAs, NDAs, ANDAs, that are just sitting around because staff has been pulled in to do other things. That's going to be a challenge for things moving forward. On the other hand, FDA isn't the only one with backlogs that we've heard about. We've heard plenty of companies have put clinical trials on hold, review things that have just been on pause because people haven't been able to either start up a trial or bioequivalence studies in the case of generics. there's going to be, I think, a shift from the COVID surge at the FDA to a second surge of, all right, well, these are all the things that were backlogged. Now let's push these into production. And FDA is going to have to deal with that backlog as well. So it may be until 2022 until we start to see a sense of normalcy again. We were talking about that backlog of guidance, and I don't want to belabor this too much, but this is our analysis of last year's guidance agendas versus what they were able to actually put out this year. As you can see, some divisions did quite well. However, some of that is also an artifact of when these policies were published. CBER, for example, looks like it did an amazing job here, sticking to its standard despite being so involved with vaccine authorization decisions and therapeutics. However, most of the guidance documents that it put out here were released very early on and had a lot to do with its cell and gene therapy program. CDRH and CDER, a little bit behind the 8 ball, although anyone who's watched CDER for a long time knows that many of its guidance agendas are very much, let's call them aspirational, and many of these things can endure on there for quite a while. So now that we're thinking about what comes next after the pandemic, let's also think about what changes the FDA might make, because what it said is that while it wants to return to normal, what normal looks like is going to be very different. There are a few things that we've heard consistently from various members of FDA leadership that we think are likely to be implemented in some form, shape, or fashion over the next year. The first is, I think, virtual meetings. And we heard this from Jeff Shuren recently, I believe actually at the RAPS annual conference, saying it is wonderful for him to not have to walk around the White Oak campus and be late to every single meeting he is ever invited to. The ability to click a button, join a Zoom meeting, and he's there meeting with people, that gives him more face time with the people that matter. And it's the same for all of the review staff. While it's certainly a pain not to be in the room with someone where you can get those emotional cues, that subtle, emotional intelligence that allows you to be like, wow, their mouth said one thing, but their body language said they were very uncomfortable with the prospect of that, clinical endpoint or use of a surrogate endpoint. It still is useful to have more efficient meetings, not need to travel over to the FDA's headquarters. The guy in front of you in the security line has like every single coin he's ever found on his person, like in his jackets, and can't quite get through the metal detector. I'm sure all of you have dealt with this. I know I have like 5 different times. There are some efficiencies that the FDA wants to get out of this process. Another efficiency, and speaking of which, is prioritization. What you've seen with some of these backlog policies, and especially out of the Office of In Vitro Diagnostics, led by Director Tim Stenzel, has been, if they have a backlog, they are necessarily going to have to prioritize things. So if you're developing these products, think about, how do I define importance of my product? How do I make sure that I'm at the top of that pile and not at the very bottom of that pile? Because it may be the difference between getting to market in accordance with a PDUFA or MDUFA date, or missing that date if there are issues and FDA is swamped with other things. Guidance practices is another one that I think a lot of us are looking at and have heard from the FDA. FDA has fundamentally changed the way that they put out guidance documents during the pandemic. Many more question and answer, Q&A style documents, and that's been good in some cases. Like all of a sudden you see a guidance go from we need this to we have this in a matter of weeks. However, there's a downside to that, and that is if you're running a clinical development program and that guidance document is constantly being updated with new Q&As or new adjustments, you can't run that clinical development program with any sort of certainty, because you need stability. You need to know that what you're aiming toward, the goalposts, are not going to change. And FDA's had some issues with that. They've also had some issues with things that would have been benefited from more time. For example, there was a citizen petition this week by a company that was saying, hey, the FDA's guidance, Q&A guidance on medical gowns includes a whole bunch of products which are not regulated by the FDA as medical products or medical devices. Can you change this? Like under a normal standard review, those would probably never have gotten through. However, in this case, it did. So look to some changes there. I don't want to read off every single one of these, but decentralized trials, real-world evidence, and the FDA's coronavirus treatment acceleration program. These have all been things that have been mentioned quite frequently by Amy Abernathy and Stephen Hahn and others. Expect those to be worked in some shape or fashion, especially the CTAP program, which I think borrows so heavily from the real-time oncology review program that's been used by quite a few members, especially in the development of oncology products. So wrapping up our COVID section, what should you expect here? What should we be keeping an eye on? One is FDA reforms. The FDA, as we said, is not looking to go back to the way it was in December 2019. While it wants to go further toward that than not, there are changes that it wants to make, and I think we've detailed those pretty well. If you as companies can figure out where the FDA is headed, that will help inform your regulatory strategy and make sure that you're more aligned to some of those opportunities around things like greater use of real-world evidence, for example. Second, FDA is going to be spending a lot of time playing catch-up. We'll go into this more in detail, especially around the medical device section, where we have a whole bunch of policies that we're going to talk about. But those things that were delayed in 2020 are still going to be dragged into 2021, just with some, adjustments. And expect the FDA to release additional policies, especially related to prioritization, its backlog, and how it starts to get back to normal. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit. Some of you may be familiar with this if you caught AgencyIQ's webinar earlier in November. Some of this may be a bit familiar, but for anyone who wasn't, happy to go into this again, because the election is always an exciting time at the FDA. A new president means a new administration, new officials at HHS, new policy advisors, and of course, a new commissioner at the FDA, and with them, new staff that they're looking to bring in to help shape and mold the regulatory direction of the agency. I think, though, when we're looking at the Biden administration, while Biden has certainly made mention of the FDA far more than I think would be normally expected in a typical presidential transition year, there's still a lot that we don't know about what he might do under the current scenario. That being said, though, based on our review of his campaign website, what he said, and just careful tracking of the industry, we think that there are kind of three main buckets that a Biden administration is likely to take action on. One is it wants to build its own policies. Any new administration wants to say, I'm going to put my stamp on this. This agency is a reflection of our policy priorities and values. And for Biden, what he said consistently is COVID-19 is going to take up the bulk of his response during that first year. Well, FDA has been heavily involved in that. Pardon me, a bit of a tickle in my throat. I think most of what we're likely to see the FDA taking action on is around supply chain resiliency, things where are active pharmaceutical ingredients made? Where are the constituent parts that make up medical devices made? Are there ways in which we can move these, the production processes for these back to the US? Are you doing so based on an incentive program, or is it more of the carrot and the stick? Like, you come to the US, we'll put you on a favorable reimbursement path for CMS. Trump has taken a little bit of a different path where it's like, if you're a contractor for a US agency like CMS or the VA, if you're not making these products in the US by whatever it was, 2023, we're not going to be paying you anymore. We're going to be looking for other folks. So there may be some changes there. That as well has corresponding regulatory challenges. As almost everyone on this call probably knows, you can't just open up a new facility and be like, oh yeah, we have all the same equipment we did at the last place. You need to validate all of that manufacturing equipment, your processes, your people, your QSRs, or your validation with 21 CFR 211. There's a lot of different things that go into that entire process, and it's going to be quite challenging. I think too, Biden, when I think of Biden and the FDA, my immediate thought is Biden is associated closely with the Biden Moonshot Initiative. Oncology is something he cares about very much. And while I haven't seen any specific plans that might involve the FDA, I am very much expecting to start seeing the foundations of some of these policies take shape in 2021. And that could be good news for the oncology sector. It may also be good news for the neurology sector. I mean, Biden has frequently name dropped conditions like Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases and said he wants to focus on those. And I think as an aging person himself, these are issues that are close to his heart and probably close to many of his friends as well. Now, shifting on from building, we have rebuilding. I think no issue gets more attention from me as it relates to this than the FDA's reputation itself. The FDA has been dragged into one too many political bare knuckle fights this year. There have been way too many rumors about, hey, Stephen Hahn's being called to the website, to the White House rather. Is he going to have his job at the end of today after his meeting with Mark Meadows or some other White House official? I believe Biden wants to move past that, and the person that he brings in for the commissioner, and there are some names which have been raised quite often, including Josh Sharfstein, who is a principal deputy commissioner under Margaret Hamburg. There's Luciano Borio, who has been talked about, who was the acting chief scientist and is an expert in medical countermeasure development. A few other folks as well, but the people that he wants to bring in, I think he wants someone who is above the politics, who is beyond reproach and is going to play a key role in making sure that the FDA's reputation as a neutral arbiter of science policy is kind of rebuilt and reclaimed. Drug importation, I think, is the other one where Trump has done quite a few policies related to drug importation, drug pricing. There's a lot more that the FDA can do here, and I think there will be some areas where Biden wants to tinker with those policies, kind of put his own stamp on them, own them, maybe make adjustments or modifications to them. So keep an eye on that. Finally, dismantling, and I don't think there's a whole lot here that's like specific to the FDA, but there are a lot of executive orders which have had profound impacts on the FDA and the way that it releases, for example, guidance documents. Some of those I actually quite like on a personal level, like the fact that the FDA now sends some of these guidance documents to OMB from at least a transparency standpoint is fantastic. I'm able to actually see now, hey, the FDA put this guidance document over to OMB and I can expect that, next week, or wow, this is a really controversial one. Let's see how long this takes to review. On the other hand, it does slow down the development of guidance, so I can understand both sides of this as to why they might want to remove this. Trump has also released an executive order that would seek to make it easier to fire policy officials, and the FDA has many policy officials. I could easily see the Biden administration wanting to claw back part of that and kind of cement certain civil service protections. Congress is clearly going to be a very important part of any Biden administration. And I think in key part, what it wants to do here, there's going to be narrow areas of overlap between a Biden administration and, say, a Republican Senate. And unless there is some sort of blue miracle coming out of the runoff elections in Georgia next month, it is very likely that we will see divided government. Now, a few areas, and I don't want to read off every single one of these, but a few key areas where I think we're going to be able to find some alignment. One, user fees, and gosh, I hope they're able to align on this in 2022, because if not, there are a whole bunch of programs which are going to be in existential trouble, if not, consistent dread for much of the next year. The question for me is a little bit less around, do user fees pass? Because I think there's always been broad bipartisan support going back to the, pretty much original PDUFA reauthorization and more recent years under the 2012 FDASIA legislation, the 2017 FDA Reauthorization Act. What becomes an interesting thought experiment, though, is what happens if, because this is seen as must-pass legislation, that other things like drug pricing reforms get tacked onto this. If other things like diagnostic reforms, like those in our bottom right corner here, the VALID Act, which has been advanced in the Senate and House for quite a while, could that become less of a reform bill and more of a Christmas tree onto which everyone is hanging their ornaments, and every single reform related to COVID, drug pricing, and everything else just gets attached? The more it does, the more risk it's at of not being passed in its entirety. Drug pricing, as I mentioned earlier, I think is another area where there may be narrow alignment. And I say narrow because despite the fact that Republicans and Democrats are aligned on the idea that drug pricing reform needs to happen, the exact magnitude of that is quite unclear. And Democrats kind of stymied Republican efforts to do this during the past 4 years. It's entirely possible Republicans repay the favor to a Biden administration in the hopes of kind of making sure he's not able to use that as a positive campaign issue. So what should we expect in 2021? I think the overarching thing for much of this is stability. Much of the FDA staff who are actually in charge of doing things, the Janet Woodcocks, the Jeff Shurins, the lower level policy staff, those are very consistent from administration to administration. That's not likely to change. And while we are likely to get new leadership at the top, it usually takes that leader a while to kind of get in and go, all right, here's what I want to do. Here's my plan. Here's my agenda. It's very rare that you have a person like a Scott Gottlieb, for example, who comes in and knows the lay of the land, the layout of the building, who their colleagues are, and are able to just get started on day one. That's even more challenging in a pandemic, quite frankly, because if you do have someone who's been out of the agency for a while, they may not know all the key players, and therefore making policy is going to be almost by definition more difficult to get done. FDA stability, I think, plays into this a lot. In some agencies throughout the government, a new Biden administration means like, they're going to go into EPA and they're going to just like claw back a whole bunch of stuff that was done. For the FDA, though, much of its activities throughout the Trump administration was mostly uncontroversial. The extent that they got involved in politics at all was around generic drug pricing, the Drug Competition Action Plan, and right to try. And even those were mostly like, this is just good government stuff that we're probably planning on doing anyways, the exception of right to try. We're planning on doing these things anyways. Let's just package them up and make them look nice and get the administration off our back. That changed with the COVID-19 response, and in particular, the responses around EUAs for hydroxychloroquine and convalescent plasma. But in 2021, we may start to see some adjustments, but I think most of that will be focused on transparency. So into our individual sectors. As I was saying earlier, we have write-ups for each of these. And I should note before we kind of get too far into this, where all of these are coming from is AgencyIQ has spent the last few weeks really putting our heads together and thinking about where's the FDA headed next year. The end result of that thinking is not this presentation, rather it's a huge report that we're coming out with next week called our FDA Forecast 2021. This is a preview of that report, and it goes into an extraordinary amount of detail for every single one of these. So think of this more as the teaser version of our longer reports that'll be coming out soon. And for everyone on this webinar, or even folks who are maybe watching this later, we're going to make sure you get a copy of that, because we're really proud of our predictions. We back up everything. This is not just like, me sitting down and going like, well, yeah, this could work. This might stick. We back it all up with extensive reporting that we've done and our news team over at Politico has done. So the first one, though, I think I've been looking at this for a while, and to think about pharmaceutical quality in this day and age, we actually need to start not at 2020, but all the way back in 2014. And as some of you have been in the industry for a while, probably remember that was the year the FDA put out a guidance document in which it called for the mandatory reporting of quality metrics. These are metrics that would have been collected by a pharmaceutical or biopharmaceutical company about the state of manufacturing quality at their facility, things like lot acceptance rate or rejection rate, things like that. What the FDA experienced after putting out that guidance document, though, was kind of a swift reaction, a negative reaction from industry, which claimed that it lacked the authority to do this, and that actually generating these metrics was going to be a fair bit more difficult than regulators had given it credit for. So as a result of that, a year later, the FDA put out a revised draft guidance, which said, we still want quality metrics, but we want a more streamlined version of this, and we want to make it a voluntary program. Now, as you can probably expect, all the companies that didn't want to give this information over on a mandatory basis largely didn't want to give it over on a voluntary basis either. And while this guidance document has remained in draft form, it's largely been collecting dust. Now, in 2020, though, if you were paying real close attention, you probably saw the FDA has been making a lot of moves in the background to actually update this program and make it fit for purpose. And it was doing this before the pandemic, but once the pandemic came around, it kind of put into it a renewed sense of purpose around how that program might be improved upon. So first, some of the improvements that the FDA has made here in the non-pandemic related initiatives sector. It's been working for years with a group called the University of St. Gallen's, and they have a group within there called the Operational Excellence Partnership. That partnership is working on validating many of the metrics that the FDA wants to collect and making sure that those metrics are meaningful, that they're actually associated with measures of quality. One of the original counterarguments from industry was, well, yeah, a high lot rejection rate may indicate that I have some real problems, or in our case, it actually indicates that I have a very high level of quality and that I'm discerning enough to err on the side of caution and reject whatever thing even might not pass muster. So I don't want to be punished for doing a good job here. I need to see that you understand these sorts of distinctions. So the FDA has been working on that for a while. It also launched a quality maturity pilot program where it's actually seeking to test out some of these measures for finished dose pharmaceuticals and active pharmaceuticals ingredients in foreign markets. It did a lot of other things related to pandemic-related activities, and I think the key thing here is that the FDA had a real problem in 2020, and that problem was it couldn't easily get into foreign manufacturing facilities. It just either it was banned from traveling or it didn't feel safe bringing its employees into a location where they might get COVID, or worse, spread COVID to a facility that might be manufacturing a sort of critical drug. And therefore, what it's tried to do instead is rely on remote inspections. And while I think all of us have been waiting eagerly for the FDA to put out a guidance document on exactly what constitutes a remote inspection and how they plan to do that and what sponsors can probably expect, it has been being used as these kind of desk inspections. I think the other really big thing, though, is it released or indicated that it soon plans to release a pilot program on remote inspections. And I want to talk about this next because in listening to Elizabeth Miller talk at the FDLI conference last month about this, it makes clear that this remote inspection pilot program is awful similar to what a quality metrics program would be. And FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn and one of the associate commissioners, Anand Shah, have talked about how the FDA wants to recreate this quality rating system as recently as September 2020. And Elizabeth Miller was talking about how they want to do a remote review of records that the firm is already required to maintain. And reading into the details, it looks awful similar to the exact kind of language that FDA has previously used for quality metrics. Now, the key thing that I'm keeping in mind here is what's changed. You see, in 2014 or 15, industry could expect that even if they don't want FDA looking at their records remotely, they'd still be able to get into their facility. But now the FDA has two problems. It may not be able to get in all facilities because some countries are still restricting travel and the ability of FDA inspectors to get in there. The second part, though, is that it probably has a massive backlog of these inspections that it needs to do. So what it has, the FDA, is leverage. What it can tell industry is essentially, listen, based on this backlog, we need to make some prioritizations. If you're sending us quality metrics information like we're asking, we can prioritize you. We can say, we'll defer an in-person inspection, until later on, next year, whenever we decide to. But if you're actively ignoring us or you're not sending us that information, that's where we're going to have a problem, or we might, accelerate enforcement action against you. So that leverage is going to be a really important thing to keep in mind throughout the next year. So I think for 2021, expect to see a lot of things related to quality metrics and coming soon. Again, that idea of leverage is something that all of us should really be keeping an eye on. The other thing too, though, is if you're expecting to need to do that, start thinking about how you might collect that information, contextualize it, send it along. The companies that are more advanced in their quality systems and have systems, by the way, that are capable of generating meaningful metrics, those companies are going to be ahead of the curve. They're going to be able to, deal with this much easier than companies that may have an antiquated system. I think generic drug companies in particular may have a challenge with some of these, especially since upgrades to these systems are expensive and a lot of companies work on lower margins than say branded pharma or branded biologics. Finally, return to normalcy is going to take time, and especially with FDA having this huge backlog, like it may need to do a flurry of inspections just to play catch up. And it's likely that there are going to be lots of things that are continued to be delayed throughout much of the year and potentially into 2022. So all of you have heard me speaking for quite a while. I want to bring in Laura D'Angelo to talk about medical devices. Laura, we've seen quite an interesting year for devices, perhaps even more so than pharma, just due to the essential role of things like PPE and diagnostics in the response to COVID. But as we think about traditional medical devices, how would you characterize 2020 and what we're going to be seeing going into 2021?
Right. So, I mean, I would certainly agree that 2020 was kind of a banner year for CDRH, especially considering how out front it was on a lot of the COVID response. Diagnostics are housed within CDRH, as Alec mentioned, personal protective equipment devices. So CDRH, much like the other centers, had a fairly packed agenda heading into 2020. And if we had been giving this presentation in December of 2019, this would be a very different presentation. But just because that these policies were delayed or kind of had to take a back burner while CDRH had to surge itself into OHT7 or the Office of In Vitro Diagnostics, which Alec has spoken about, it doesn't mean that they are getting tossed in the bin. CDRH was able to actually make quite a bit of progress on some of its established priorities, which include these on this slide, but at a high level, modernization to the 510K pathway. Digital health has been a big percolating issue for the Center for Devices for a long time. Orthopedic and implant research, and something that I would have said would be a top priority last December, ISO 13485 transition, so switching from the FDA specific quality system regulations for medical devices into kind of the international standards. This is currently postponed, but it's been delayed before. But we were able to make some progress on our priorities, and those that were slowed, we could see some actual lessons learned from the pandemic and the way that CDRH has, had to respond quickly and iteratively to the pandemic in informing the way that these policies will move forward. So looking ahead to 2021, there are three big segments that we found conceptually interesting. So digital health is a huge and significant priority for CDRH, and moving forward into the other segments as well, especially as digital health kind of comes into its own. So CDRH was able to establish the Digital Health Center of Excellence this year. For those not familiar, the COE is intended to kind of consolidate digital health expertise into one division within the FDA. So it does live in CDRH, but the intention is that the COE will be providing digital health support and a unified voice in all of the review divisions. They'll be leading guidance generation, but for now, in the stand-up year, a big priority for the Center of Excellence is going to be setting the baseline things that you need for regulation, which are standards and definition, and kind of figuring out how they'll work within kind of a cross-center function and how they'll actually be integrated into teams. We've also had the National Evaluation System for Health Technology run in partnership with MDIC, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, stand up. So we are seeing a pretty operational push towards our digital health priorities that came kind of from a pressure test, especially during 2020. Going into 2021, we are expecting a lot of updates on kind of the CDRH's marquee program. So the safety and performance-based pathway, the accreditation scheme for conformity assessment pilot, which is ASCA. Also a new focus on the breakthrough device program, which due to reimbursement changes out of CMS, there has been huge industry interest in, and Tim Stenzel, who is director of OHT7, has talked about using lessons about iterative reviews and templates as a way to kind of increase the efficiency of that program. We've also got the Safer Technology program due to be finalized hopefully this year. And then as Alec was talking about, CDRH is currently in what they're calling a 90-day surge, where staff is being brought out from other divisions and into review divisions that are focused more on COVID. So we are seeing, as I'm sure at least some of you are aware, applications that just aren't getting acted on. So Q-subs and pre-subs specifically are the ones that are facing kind of the most challenges, but also de novos, PMAs, and all of these things that do require hands-on interaction that are just creating a second backlog. So the surge is currently trying to fill or address the backlog in EUA submissions, but we are creating a separate backlog for things that do need to get addressed in surges on surges on surges. And then, I'm sorry I said that, then the ISO transition is a huge one. Now, we're expecting that this year, but something that is probably going to be informed by this is the actual transition period. So as we can see, 2021's priorities, this is from the guidance agenda, really have a lot of carryover, which you'll see in the asterisk, with things that just weren't able to be gotten to this year. So the Safer Technology Program for medical devices, which is more iterative reviews for products that don't meet the breakthrough designation, so decision support software, remanufacturing. And then we have some new priorities, a lot of which have to do with the COVID pandemic. So obviously the transition plan to move away from EUAs, which is highly anticipated, and as well as the device shortage guidance. So what we're expecting from 2021 is a lot of action from CDRH, but a lot of action that are things that we are expecting. Regulators need to play catch up. We have our established list of things that we were preparing for as an industry going into this year or carried over to next year. But review delays are likely to extend for quite a while. The backlog of EUAs is turning into a backlog of regular submissions. Q-subs and pre-subs that weren't able to get feedback, do continue to face outstanding questions. And that is going to be, as Alec mentioned earlier, potential for a new prioritization triage system that we'll see out of the transition. And the pandemic is likely to lead to regulatory changes based on the way that CDRH was able to kind of respond in a very quick and comprehensive way to a huge influx might inform best practices going forward.
Thanks, Laura. I think too the transition period that we were talking about earlier, the FDA is not trying to be like, the character Kramer in Seinfeld, just bashing in the door, sliding in the room like, hey guys, new policy. They want to smooth it out.
Absolutely.
A smoother transition period, especially for something like ISO 13485, where you've got maybe a large global manufacturer of medical devices that may be very used to dealing with ISO 13485 already. However, compared to a smaller organization that's maybe US based, they don't have a huge product portfolio, that's going to be a significant lift. And what we've seen from the FDA in past years, and I think the unique device identification phase in is a perfect example here. FDA frequently pushes back the enforcement dates for these policies, even if it wants it done within a year. As long as good arguments are made that a good faith effort is being made, they're usually reasonable and able to accommodate that. So let's shift gears from medical devices into generic drugs. I think this one may be a little bit controversial in title, but let me explain kind of what's going on here. It's no surprise to many of you that the FDA in the past few years has been making extraordinary strides and improvements in making sure that generic drugs are getting approved. If you look at 2013, which is probably the last year that the Generic Drug User Fee Act, which was passed in 2012, was not in effect, we've basically seen a straight shot rise from there up through fiscal year 2019. Now, 2020, we saw a bit of a difficult year, and it's not clear quite yet whether or not this is solely attributable to the pandemic or a combination of other factors. It was clearly difficult to get certain products reviewed, get applications finalized, do basic things like bioequivalence testing, site inspections. There are lots of different ways in which this number may have artificially fallen. However, I think there are some long-term things that are getting lost by just looking at this chart, because if you're just look at this, you're like, wow, the generics industry is just on a gangbusters stretch here. This is probably going to go on for quite a while. What our paper explains in depth, and what I'll kind of summarize here, is there's actually reason to believe that the music for the generic industry, it's not stopping, but it sure is slowing and maybe playing a slightly different tune. And one of the ways you can look at that is just by looking at the number of abbreviated new drug applications that have been submitted on a quarter-by-quarter basis to the FDA. Now, with the exception of some obvious outliers here, I believe in Q1, Q2, 2014, there was some change which made it, I think it was around filing fees, which made it substantially more lucrative to submit all your stuff in Q1 as opposed to incur the higher filing fee in Q2 or whatever. But aside from that, since 2016, we've actually started to see a fairly steady decrease in the number of ANDAs and new ANDAs that have been submitted to the FDA. Now, how do we kind of square the increase in the number of ANDAs versus those decreasing applications? Well, one of them is the FDA has historically had quite a large and significant backlog of applications which it's been working through, and it's now started to review many of those, but many of the applications that are still being approved are not necessarily new. They've been around for a while. They've been going through iterative review cycles. It's long been known that the generics industry has had some significant challenges getting first cycle reviews through the FDA. There are some other factors, though, which are not as easy to capture in kind of base data as this one. There are three trends in particular I want to note. One is we've seen a shift from companies, in particular branded companies, developing small molecule pharmaceutical products, that is those that are eligible for generic drug competition, and moving toward products that are large molecule, that are biologics, that are by definition not eligible for generic competition. I think from a sales perspective, when I last looked at the data about a year or two ago, it was about more than 50% of the gross sales of drugs that were launched in the last year were biologics. From kind of a cash flow perspective, I think 40 out of the top 100 drugs were listed in the purple book. And as a result, as that continues to go up and up, as we start to understand more and more about the underlying biological mechanisms behind certain diseases, those products are just not going to be available for the generic drug industry to take to market as generics later on. So that's going to kind of foreclose certain avenues of the market for competition. The second issue, and I think this one's flown a little bit under the radar, is that more and more of the market is being focused on drugs for rare diseases. It's unclear in many of these cases whether or not the size of the market for that rare disease can actually support multiple generic competitors, even one, let alone two or three, which may make it quite challenging for those products to, again, attract sufficient amounts of generic competition. Another challenge in the generic space is that many of the companies in there have very specialized support capabilities, which allow them to kind of more closely serve the needs either for a reimbursement perspective or a patient care perspective of those patients with rare diseases. And it's more of a concierge model. Again, not a competency that many generic drug companies have traditionally held. So as a result, some of what we've seen with, again, that increasing number of generic drug approvals over the past few years, some of this has just been a reflection of the FDA making some extraordinary improvements to its generic drug regulatory processes, starting in 2012 under the first authorization on the Generic Drug User Fee Act, again in 2017 under the GDUFA II legislation. We've seen just a huge number of things related to hiring of more staff, processes that are just aiming to get a more predictable process, other improvements around just getting some of the shenanigans out of the process, around gaming of citizen petitions, for example. As the FDA has done more and more of these, though, I think what I'm coming away with is much of the low-hanging fruit as it relates to regulatory improvements, they're gone. They've been made. You can't, continue to make 20% gains in productivity every single year just by hiring additional staff. Eventually, you reach that point of diminishing returns. And I think, there's clearly still improvements to be made, especially around, some recent REMS changes under the CREATES Act, which create a covered product authorization process and stuff like that. But the returns are going to be coming more and more small. So when we talk about this in our paper at length, the argument that I come away with is generic companies need to realize that, like, the music is slowing. For some of them, that may be the call that they need to invest heavily in biosimilar capabilities, or just realize like what's at stake here for them, that the market is just going to become less lucrative. So we saw quite a few things in 2020 related to, again, steady process improvements around citizen petitions. FDA has been really heavily focused on complex generics and trying to get more policies out in the market for them. Process simplifications, working with Congress on things like the CREATES Act, which was successfully passed, lots of investments in regulatory science and, again, REMS. I think for me, if I were to characterize like what was the biggest thing I saw in 2020, complex generics. By far, the FDA is just continuing to invest really heavily in that, including launching a new Center for Complex Generics through the University of Maryland, actually my alma mater here. So I might be a little biased in thinking, wow, that's super interesting. What do we expect in 2021 though? A few things. One, continued focus on complex generics. FDA has said that it wants to continue specifically putting out product-specific guidances, which say, you know, here's a really complex product, here's how you actually put it out there. And they've been making huge investments in regulatory science around that too. One great example to exemplify this, if you were looking through the contracting notices for the FDA a few months back, you probably saw they wanted to buy a high-speed camera, not because they want to make interesting YouTube videos of like drugs disintegrating, rather they wanted to see drug dispersion in slow motion for a complex inhaler product. So a really good example there. For GDUFA reauthorization, clearly they're focused on that right now and expect to see some conversation around where does this program go for GDUFA 3. Orange Book modernization, and you've probably seen FDA has been floating all sorts of ideas around where it heads next for the Orange Book. Additional guidance, in particular around covered product authorization, that process by which a product, if it is covered by a risk evaluation mitigation strategy plan, which some sponsors have used to prevent generic competition from actually accessing those samples. FDA now has a new process for that, and to date they haven't actually defined how it works. So we're expecting guidance there. Should be a real page turner, that one. And finally, Congress has continued to say, like, find us ways where we can make this market more efficient. So expect to see some more ideas being raised there. But I think overall, what do we expect in 2021? Continued slow, methodical process improvements, which is probably going to help out a lot of generics manufacturers, especially ones that are invested in complex generics. But again, a more efficient process is not going to change some of these inexorable market trends around a shift toward rare disease drugs, a shift toward biologics that is just not going to become any easier with time. So keep an eye on that. We did get one question in from what is FDA's plan for the manufacturing audit for PAI, or pre-approval inspection, that have been canceled or postponed due to the pandemic? That's a good question, and it's guidance that we're still waiting to hear. I think the plan really is they need to figure out how they prioritize where they go next. Which facilities are they going to care about most? You know, are they going to look specifically at biologics facilities before they do generics facilities, just because there's a higher risk of contamination or if something went wrong? Are they going to look at a company's prior enforcement record or history, or if there's been any import alerts? What the FDA has been doing throughout the pandemic, for example, is actually testing products that are being imported in the market. So even though they're not in your facility, they're still kind of testing the quality of the output there. So that may inform that as well. A big question mark on that, and I think what we were talking about with respect to the quality metrics program is also going to play heavily into that. To the extent that companies are willing to play ball with the FDA, there may be a different enforcement approach as opposed to those companies that are not providing access to certain information that FDA wants to see. So great question. Shifting gears once again, let's talk about biosimilars. And this was a really challenging one for us to think through, because on one hand, much of what the FDA has been doing in the biosimilar space is conceptually similar to what it's been doing in the generic space, with one key exception. The FDA has not approved that many biosimilars. You know, if you think back to that generics chart, the FDA has approved in some years more than 1,000 final and tentative ANDAs. FDA in its entire history has only approved 28 biosimilar products. And that's not for lack of trying, it's just, it is a slow, difficult market to get products into right now. And even if you look at, this chart from the FDA that was made available a few weeks ago, there is increasing interest in biosimilar development programs. We're now up more than 100 of these programs, but at the same time, there's been so many hurdles. Some of those hurdles are regulatory in nature. The FDA has found it difficult, quite frankly, to characterize whether or not a product is biosimilar to another and the standards that it requires to prove that. We were looking at some studies earlier this year which found that many of the biosimilar studies are as large and complex as some of the clinical data studies that are used to actually support a full original BLA through the 351A pathway. So very challenging, very costly. There are also legal challenges which have precluded market entry for some companies, where you may have gotten past the FDA, but can you get past that company's patent lawyers? Like to see you try to navigate that patent thicket. Quite difficult. Another one too is just some companies don't always want to market their products. Sometimes the rebate traps, as some of you may be aware of, are quite difficult to navigate. So as a result, though, the FDA has been making some changes to try and clarify the pathway for biosimilars, which to me, to have all of this guidance and key questions raised 10 years after the founding of the biosimilar pathway under the 2010 Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, as it's more commonly known, this was kind of a big year for the FDA. The release of major updates to the Purple Book. I think any of the regulatory intelligence folks on this call were probably like, hallelujah, at long last, this Purple Book is no longer a PDF. Like, welcome to the 21st century FDA. I hope you enjoy it here. Please stay a while and keep making some improvements. It was a big deal. There were some also just foundational changes. There's a new definition for what the FDA considers to be a biological product coming out of the budget reauthorization process, not in 2020, but in the waning days of 2019. There's a new definition of biologic, which now includes chemically synthesized polypeptides of particular relevance to certain insulin-like products that are now regulated as biologics under this deemed to be a license transition. This is a thing originally planned in 2010. 2020 was the year that many products which were biologics in character, but originally approved through the new drug application pathway as kind of the pathway used for small molecule products, they're now considered to be biologics. As a result of that, we should see some interesting stuff, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We also saw 3 really interesting guidance documents, which I'll talk about in our next slide, but just briefly, FDA has really thrown down the marker on, in particular, what it wants to see from biosimilar promotion, which we may start seeing much more of now that we're starting to see, double digits of biosimilars, and what it considers to be an interchangeable product, including how it wants those products to be labeled. For me, though, the big wild card over the entire sector, and why we mention that this is kind of a high-risk year for biosimilars, is that the Supreme Court is still set to hear arguments over the fate of the ACA. If this feels like deja vu all over again, it is maddening for many of us who kind of watched through the Supreme Court hearings back in 2012 on like, is the Affordable Care Act constitutional? Is the individual mandated tax? Is it a penalty? How do you define this? Under a admittedly probably not likely scenario, but nevertheless somewhat of a doomsday one, if the Supreme Court does decide that this Obamacare is unconstitutional, and further that the entire law is so inexorably linked that it cannot be separated apart, the biosimilars provisions of the ACA, called the BPCIA, would be declared unconstitutional as well, and the entire biosimilar program would be thrown out. That is a big deal. And certainly there is some kind of thought that, well, this is a popular program, it's not controversial, surely Congress would step in and take action on this. And let me just skip ahead a little bit to talk about kind of the flow chart here on the bottom half of this. Even if the ACA is declared unconstitutional, the court may decide, well, parts of it are unconstitutional, but the biosimilar stuff has nothing to do with this, that can keep on going. If the whole thing is thrown out, though, there kind of becomes 2 different choices. One is Congress may need to immediately act to replace that, and it may just say, you know what, replace it as is. We don't want to mess with this. The temptation, though, may be that if we need to get this passed again, there may be an opportunity to say, make improvements. Maybe a 7-year or 12-year rather market exclusivity process is less preferable than a shorter one. So we're likely to see quite a lot coming out of that. I'm going to skip back though and just talk briefly about these 3 foundational guidance documents that we saw in 2020, because I think these in some cases kind of flew under the radar but are super important. The first one is a guidance FDA put out on licensure for fewer than all conditions of use for which the reference product has been licensed. In other words, you could have a biosimilar that's out there on the market or an interchangeable product that uses or markets itself as only treating one condition, despite the fact that the original biosimilar or biological product is marketed for multiple conditions. That's a big deal because it makes it considerably easier for that product to come onto the market without needing to wade through a really dense patent thicket. And in the generics industry, this happens all the time with kind of what they call labeling carve-outs. To see it here, to see the FDA kind of formally say, yes, we're fine with that, is a big deal, especially as it relates to interchangeable products, where that product is, according to the FDA, supposed to be exactly the same. If that standard of exactly the same is just made on a one condition basis, it's probably going to be easier for those companies to actually prove that those products are exactly the same. I think promotional labeling was another really interesting thing to me. In it, FDA actually includes specific language about if your product is interchangeable, and today we haven't actually seen any interchangeable products, but touch on that in a second, that one, you should have a statement on your label explaining this is what a biosimilar product is. I think a lot of us, like now that generics have been out on the market for 36 years or so under the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984, we're just kind of used to like, oh yeah, everyone knows what a generic is. People do not, in many cases, don't know what a biosimilar product is, let alone what an interchangeable product is. So FDA actually wants companies to define that on the label and also avoid disparaging in any promotional activities. If you're a biologics manufacturer, don't disparage your biosimilar competition for marketing itself for fewer than all conditions or for only being biosimilar instead of like the original, like some sort of like Werther's candy ad. Like FDA has some very specific language here that it wants people to be careful of. I see all my co-panelists just groaning at my terrible jokes. I agree. Okay, so what can we expect in 2021? A few things. One, final guidance. All the guidance documents that I just talked about were in draft form. Probably going to see them in final form. We're likely to see some new guidance, including one on product class specific recommendations. That's out of CBER's guidance agenda, so expect to see that. We may see the first interchangeable biological products. That to me is going to be really fascinating to watch, because to the extent that we do see the first one, we'll see policies in place and released around the same time to support that and make sure that everyone else thereafter kind of knows what the rules of the road are. Essentially, the FDA needs to figure that out for itself before or during the review of that product. After that, it'll hopefully be able to release some more information there. We're likely to see some pressure from Congress, including on quickly reviewing biosimilar and interchangeable insulins. And to be clear, that's where I think that first interchangeable product will be from. A lot of these products that were like deemed to be a license under that changeover this year, we'll probably see first interchangeable product I can borderline guarantee will be some sort of insulin product. Incentives for interchangeables, again, we just talked about these guidance documents that it's likely to be a lot easier for these products to come to market, and FDA is continually trying to make it so. And of course, BsUFA, like Medufa, PDUFA, BsUFA, and all the other UFAs out there in the world, FDA is negotiating those with industry. Keep an eye out, not just for obviously the fact that negotiations are happening, but what is the conversation around that? Where are they headed? Keep a close eye on those negotiation and meeting minutes. So other things to expect in 2021, as I said, it's a high risk year. Either everything goes fine, it's a bunch of small process improvements, or the entire house burns down and folks are left wondering what the heck happened. So as a company, you need to give some thought to, well, let's do some emergency planning. If this does happen, what would the impact be on our broader product portfolio? Because I can guarantee you if anything were to happen there, that's going to be very challenging to deal with on so many different levels. Finally, again, as we've seen in other areas, review delays are probably likely going to be continuing on. COVID has just affected every place, and CBER has been pulling in experts from some of its review divisions to, for example, review some of these new coronavirus treatments that are coming through. There's a huge wave of those, by the way, that are going through clinical trials and are expected to start reaching the EUA and filing phases for a BLA relatively soon. And again, if we do see the first interchangeable products, that would make this kind of a banner foundational year for a lot of policies. So let me pause quickly. We got another question from our chat, and feel free to submit your questions if you have them throughout. Are you aware of any plans for FDA to provide guidance regarding post-approval lifecycle management of interchangeable biosimilars? There was a little bit in the guidance related to this, not directly, but tangentially. So the guidance talked about if you already have a biological product that was approved as a BLA, not necessarily out of, hey, I want to go through all the pains of developing a BLA, but rather it's just easier, like this is essentially a biosimilar product, but I may as well just get it out there on the market. And this way, at least I have a PDUFA date. FDA said, actually, if you have that BLA approved, you can go back to it later and say, I want to be deemed an interchangeable product or a biosimilar product to another thing that's out there on the market. For me, that raises some really interesting lifecycle management approaches, because it may mean, actually, in terms of ease of market access, I'd rather get it on the market as soon as possible and then worry about interchangeability later. That way, at least I have a small sales thing and I can get additional data through real world evidence sources and databases and registries and all that. So that to me is interesting. What I haven't seen though, and maybe this just requires me reading FDA's recent guidance more closely, is around, can companies just continue to add additional indications to that interchangeable product once it's out there on the market? It stands to figure if the FDA allows you to have an interchangeable product for one indication, it would allow you to keep adding more and more on. And FDA's guidance does say that it will consider, if it doesn't claim that your product is interchangeable, it will kind of revert back and say, all right, let me split this application in two and let me assess whether or not this product is biosimilar and kind of ease things that way. So we're likely to see some of these issues start being answered this year, which I'm pretty hopeful about. All right, so I'm keeping an eye on the time. We are definitely running slow as we expected, but Laura, why don't we talk about diagnostics? And folks, if you do have questions, feel free to start bringing them in. I don't want to run out of time to answer some of your great questions, I'm sure. Laura?
Great, thanks. So we are 100% going to look at this from a very high level. If you have been keeping up, as I'm sure some of you have, with the kind of IVD LGT situation during COVID, it has been quite complex. So we're not going to try to relitigate the past 50 years of regulatory history. At a later date, maybe we will. But CDRH and FDA have really been focused on diagnostics, especially during the pandemic, for fairly obvious reasons. Those of you who are not familiar, just very quickly, laboratory developed tests are a subset of in vitro diagnostics that are intended to be developed and used within a single clinical laboratory entity. The clinical laboratory is regulated by CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, rather than the FDA. And they're intended to be used within the clinical laboratory entity in which they were developed. They're not, while FDA has traditionally held that these are medical devices, it hasn't expressed regulatory authority over these products because they are, limited in volume and limited in scope, and traditionally have been not super complex. The risk profile of these products kind of intrinsically changes during an emergency use situation, specifically because the higher risk profile in the population to begin with. So throughout COVID-19, barring a little bit at the front, FDA has required that laboratory developed test developers who are clinical laboratories do submit an emergency use authorization request to the FDA. There are benefits to EUA authorization, the legal liability shield, reimbursement under the CARES Act, all of these things. However, the FDA's requirement that clinical laboratories submit EUAs has created some consternation for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which issued a memo in August. I know what time it is. Super high level, that said that the FDA couldn't require them and directed them to move towards a voluntary EUA submission basis for clinical laboratories, which from their perspective would increase, access and kind of help make sure that everybody who needed a test could get a test. This has created a bit of a slap fight between leadership at HHS, including HHS's legal division, which sent this memo, and the HHS testing czar, Brett Giroir, who have kind of gone back and forth with the FDA in kind of a very public way, where the FDA took its ball and went home and said, we will not be reviewing any EUAs, even those submitted voluntarily. It's gone back and forth a little bit. It's created a lot of disruption for the clinical laboratory industry, especially as we talked about, the legal liability shield and reimbursement are contingent on EUA authorization. So we have seen some indications that the FDA might be loosening that stance a little bit, but this is certainly something to watch going into 2021, especially as Alec has previously discussed with a new administration incoming. So HHS's legal memo did open a opportunity for the FDA to create new diagnostic regulations that would bring LDTs into the regulatory fold through notice and comment. Although we had seen some interest in Congress about creating new pathways for diagnostics. So the three huge things that we are watching specifically related to diagnostics for 2021 are, first of all, as we've talked about, FDA and HHS kind of alignment, the discussions about what the regulatory classification and how the requirements should apply to LDTs have been in more flux in the past couple of months than they have been in the 50-year regulatory history of medical devices. And a lot of this might need to wait until President-elect Biden is in office and his kind of administrative picks are installed at HHS and FDA. There is also a prospect of diagnostic reform going into 2020. There was some interest, bipartisan, bicameral interest in creating an entirely new regulatory classification for diagnostics, kind of divorcing them from the concept of a device and establishing a diagnostic specific pathway going forward. And that enjoyed broad bipartisan, bicameral support. However, the way that that will move forward is a question. We do know that the sponsors have been taking comments with industry and they are expecting to reintroduce it in the next Congress, but we also have pushback from including Senator Rand Paul, who might be up to lead the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee, which could be a stalling point. And then a wild card, pharmacogenomics and personalized genomics is what I would have said is the top priority going into 2020. We have an outstanding citizen petition from Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, to which the FDA is going to need to respond in 2021. That will really set a path forward for pharmacogenomics, which are more direct-to-consumer LDT type of tests that have kind of broad implications for the future of diagnostics. So as far as what we are looking forward to in 2021, diagnostic policy reform is on the horizon. No matter who kind of takes control of the Senate, we are likely to see some really intense congressional interest on what the FDA did with diagnostics during the COVID-19 pandemic. There is significant interest on improving the entire system, but the scope, timing, and the direction that it goes is kind of something that needs to be defined in 2021. And the way that the reform will actually take place, or the scope of any specific form, is going to vary significantly based on who takes it up and in what way the industry can get involved. So if it happens through Congress, we already know the sponsors of the Ballot Act to reform the diagnostic pathways are taking meetings. They're open to discussion. But if FDA can simply do this through notice and comment, that could be a very different process.
Absolutely. Laura, we got a few questions in during your remarks, which I think you might be really good to help answer. One was, do you see any significant changes to combination product regulations or expectations in 2021? I was recalling and cannot remember the specifics. During the RAPS annual meeting, there was a gentleman who works at the FDA who was indicating that there are some guidance documents in the works specifically related to, I believe, co-packaged or cross-labeled. It was cross-labeled products. So that is one thing we're expecting. We've also seen some recent guidance documents from the FDA. Do you want to speak to that or anything that you're keeping your eye on?
Right. Absolutely, for sure. This is, once again, if we had had this presentation in December of 2019, I would have said that combination products is one of our top priorities, making it easier, sharing data, those kinds of things. We are expecting that to move forward in 2021. However, exactly what it looks like, and I'm sorry, when there is a pet making a lot of noise, when that action will take place is something that we are keeping an eye on. Also, something that is, I think, hugely going to be impactful going forward is the multiple function device guidance, the way that that interacts with combination products, and the way that digital health combination products are considered going forward.
Fantastic. Another question, and we've heard about this a lot from both FDA and industry. CDRH has been closing many pre-submissions with no response to industry. We understand that they're short-staffed. Do we see that this will happen through 2021, or do we see an end to the Q submission practices?
That is an excellent question. It's something that we have been hearing time and time again. What we've heard from the FDA is simply you have to understand that we are short-staffed. We are doing the best we can. We are pulling people from every division and shuffling them into OHT7, and the things that are getting hurt are Q-subs and pre-subs. I would say that it doesn't seem to be that this is going to be a permanent end to the Q-sub process. It just means that right now, when the FDA is looking at the kind of things that are triaged, they are focusing on submissions that are ready to go or ready, complete and total, and COVID specifically. So yes, this is a huge sticking point. We understand it's a challenge. And as far as when they'll get back on track, this is a 90-day surge that they're in, where all the review staff is kind of concentrated in OHT7. How that 90-day surge is going to end and whether they're going to surge back into their divisions is a huge question. We have known that this was going to be an issue for kind of a while. We know that trickling out of Q-sub and pre-sub, it's now actually affecting PMAs and de novos. So while it's not helpful, you're not alone.
All right, we had another question on IVDs versus LDTs and kind of the differences there. We're going to hold that one and probably follow up by email. Paul, that was your question, and we will make sure to follow up. All right, moving on, because we've got about 10 minutes left and 3 issues, and we are by necessity going to need to move a little bit quickly here. But the next topic that I want to talk about is cell and gene therapy products. I think most of us have seen that this area has been profoundly interesting this year. FDA put out a huge number of new policies that have really served to act as a foundation for future development in the space. Just in the early days of 2020, for example, FDA put out 3 guidance documents on retinal disorders, rare diseases, and hemophilia. One's on long-term follow-up, which I thought was especially fascinating insofar as it treated different viral vectors used within the cell and gene therapy manufacturing process, and said, you know, we're actually very comfortable with adenoviruses. We're going to require only a shorter post-approval follow-up monitoring process for that, as compared to some of these other novel vectors, let's say like a herpes virus vector, for which we're actually going to require 10 to 15 years of post-authorization follow-up. So that, to me, super interesting, and I'm sure to a lot of other folks as well. There was also a CMC guidance out as well, which I thought is something that we've heard time and time again from industry and FDA, is just a recurring issue that needs to be solved. So when I'm thinking about 2020 in general, I think FDA would have ordinarily liked to do a heck of a lot more as it relates to getting the foundations for CGT products up and running. And by CGTs, I mean, you know, both everything from traditional gene therapy to things like CAR T therapies or other cellular therapies, a kind of wide view here. However, COVID really slowed stuff down. CBER, from once being mostly focused on CGT products, now had to super focus on vaccine development, and that took a lot of their bandwidth. It's also been extremely difficult for companies to both manufacture and test CGT products. Just keeping cells safe from COVID infection is not a trivial task, and the FDA is actually expected to release further guidance on this relatively soon if you look at the last item on this list. So let me actually skip ahead one thing here. When we were looking at this at AgencyIQ, we had one of our subscribers say, Alec Cadest, who actually did the analysis for this, what we want to see is what sorts of manufacturing issues the companies face on a regular basis from the FDA when they've submitted a BLA. Let's look at those IR letters. Let's see, those interim response. What's FDA asking for? How would you characterize those? And when we actually sat down and characterized all the differences, the things that FDA was asking for, it was almost all manufacturing related. It was like north of 70% of everything was just, you've got some CMC issues that you haven't adequately defined. Please answer these and get back to us. By far the most common of those were related to testing protocols and reports. This is everything, and one example from an IR letter that just stays in my head. A company had a filtering process for their cellular product. The filter that they used was a very high-grade filter. They needed to switch that filter to another identical filter made by another manufacturer. The FDA said because they had not tested that filter to ensure that it was in fact operating at the same level of particle filtering efficiency, that they were going to need to go back and redo all that again, and it caused a delay to the approval of that application. Stuff like that, where the FDA has had a very long time to develop the regulatory science for generic drug products, for even biological products. For cell and gene therapy products, it just doesn't know what it doesn't know yet. And the things that it does know are largely details matter. And if you as a company are not in advance starting to think about, how would I scrutinize this? Did we, dot every I? Did we cross every T? That's where these delays are starting to take shape. So in 2021, I expect to see the FDA is going to continue to look at, in particular at CMC issues as one of the key barriers that keeps causing companies to receive things like complete response letters or other rejections of their applications in certain cases, because it is the problem that keeps popping up, as you might expect in kind of the early days of a new field that's under development. So in 2021, just to recap, we saw new guidance, we saw a lot of COVID delays, as we talked about, those regulatory challenges, in particular CRLs due to CMC issues. Also a few, unique regulatory issues. As companies are going before the FDA for the first time, sometimes you think, oh, of course the FDA is just, they're just focused on this. One that comes to mind, BioMarin, a biopharmaceutical company, experienced a regulatory setback because all of a sudden the FDA said, hey, for your hemophilia product, we're actually concerned about the duration of effect. And in context, it makes sense. Like if you're a hemophiliac and all of a sudden you think that you're cured from that and you engage in some risky behavior, and all of a sudden it's like, well, I am now bleeding to death because I took a risk that I shouldn't have. That's a huge risk. However, I think everyone else in the CGT space is thinking, now I need to show how long there's a duration of effect for. How long do I need to do my studies for? I thought we were going to be able to get to market in 1-2 years because we can cure this. Is there a way where we can reframe this or push it to a post-marketing setting? Becomes really important. In 2021, though, what am I looking for? New guidance, and in particular, FDA has said that they're expecting to release new guidance on chimeric antigen receptor T cell or CAR T therapies, human genome editing, and actually you may have seen yesterday, in fact, the FDA approved a modified pig, like the whole pig, not a separate part of it, modified bacon, that changed the pig such that it expresses a different cellular receptor that is less prone to allergic reactions in people. those sort of germline edits are a really thorny issue, and in particular as that moves closer to actual medical technology of can we permanently fix this genetic defect, FDA needs to really establish the rules of the road here. FDA, of course, is going to be trying to move past COVID and trying to make sure that companies are able to ensure the stability and the purity and the quality of their products moving forward. PDUFA, if you haven't been checking already, and even as early as the most recent negotiating minutes, FDA is heavily focused on CGTs. One area in particular is around real-world evidence, and can that be used to kind of augment the trial data either before market or after market to help people do that long-term follow-up studies that are required. And finally, personnel. This is perhaps the biggest issue facing the FDA. And when I was at PwC, I was reading about this a little bit and was speaking with some of the folks who run recruiting for some large biopharmaceutical companies, and they say, you know, even we find it difficult to get the right gene therapy talent into our facilities because our competitors rather are offering a gold Rolex if you sign up in addition to a giant bonus. FDA is not offering anyone a gold Rolex, maybe not even at the end of their career when they retire. As a result, it's very, very difficult for them to hire these people because they can leave for industry and make 3-4 times as much almost overnight. So to the extent that FDA isn't able to get as many people in the door, it's not going to be able to have that same level of either experience or review efficiency as it might in other areas. So things that we're expecting, again, to recap, the challenges associated with COVID are very likely to continue into 2021 and make it a little bit difficult. We're going to continue to see manufacturing issues, and in particular, just the way in which industry helps FDA to set this foundation is going to be extremely important going forward. So I know we are nearing the end of time. I do want to say we have some other issues on here. I think all of you are able to download the slides. I made them available through RAP, so you can cycle through this in the brief 20 seconds. OTCs are going to be huge next year. What you probably saw this year is that the FDA was able to get, and Congress somehow sneaked it past, a brand new over-the-counter user fee bill in the Coronavirus Response Act, and therefore we are going to see some huge changes in 2021. That's going to be very big for obviously the OTC and non-prescription drug industry. Takeaways there, though, are that there's going to be some short-term changes, some long-term changes. If companies are ready for it, they're going to be able to take advantage of a huge new market opportunity. To the extent that companies aren't, they may just see and continue to see business as usual for a while. Finally, in the dietary supplement sector, what we're expecting to see is a massive change around cannabidiol or CBD. In the waning days of 2018, we saw a huge change under the Farm Bill, which created regulatory parity between hemp and marijuana, which had the net effect of having CBD be legal for distribution. However, the FDA is working on an enforcement policy, which we believe, based on everything that they've said, is going to make it substantially easier for companies to market CBD products, likely in a way that's akin to dietary supplements. However, as with the quality metrics guidance, FDA has something that's very important here, and that is leverage. Essentially, it can set the terms of how these companies will be able to come to market, because technically all of them right now are illegal under the FD&C Act because they're kind of being marketed akin to dietary supplements. So expect to see some very big changes there. Now, I want to bring Colleen back in because we've got some things that we want to just tell you about, and we'll be following up with all of you about as well. And of course, if you did ask questions that we didn't get to, we have, I believe, Alex A can confirm, but we should be able to follow up with all of you by email and make sure that we're answering not just your questions, but providing some additional detail we can't hear on the spot. Colleen?
Great, thanks, Alec. Yes, just a couple of things. To that point, we will follow up with those who did not have their questions answered and get back to you. Happy to set up some time with Laura or Alec. Also in the follow-up email you'll receive from RAPS. You will see my email address in there. And so if you are interested in learning more about AgencyIQ, just send me an email. And we can also send along the slides that we use today. My email is also at the bottom there, connolly@agencyIQ.com. And so multiple ways to get in touch with us. And so be on the lookout for that follow-up email to receive my information and to receive the slides.